This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 7. Naughty Nan. "Fritz, I've got a new idea," cried Mrs. Bear, as she met her husband one day after school. "Well, my dear, what is it?" And he waited willingly to hear the new plan, for some of Mrs. Joe's ideas were so droll it was impossible to help laughing at them, though usually they were quite sensible, and he was glad to carry them out. "Daisy needs a companion, and the boys would be all the better for another girl among them. You know we believe in bringing up little men and women together, and it is high time we acted up to our belief. They pet and tyrannize over Daisy by turns, and she is getting spoilt. Then they must learn gentle ways, and improve their manners, and having girls about will do it better than anything else." "You are right, as usual. Now, who shall we have?" asked Mr. Bear, seeing by the look in her eye that Mrs. Joe had someone all ready to propose. "Little Annie Harding." "What, Naughty Nan, as the lads call her?" cried Mr. Bear, looking very much amused. "Yes, she is running wild at home since her mother died, and it is too bright a child to be spoilt by servants. I have had my eye on her for some time, and when I met her father in town the other day I asked him why he did not send her to school. He said he would gladly if he could find as good a school for girls as ours was for boys. I know he would rejoice to have her come, so suppose we drive over this afternoon and see about it." "Have you not cares enough now, my Joe, without this little gypsy to torment you?" asked Mr. Bear, patting the hand that lay on his arm. "Oh dear no," said Mother Bear briskly. "I like it, and never was happier than since I had my wilderness of boys. You see, Fritz, I feel a great sympathy for Nan, because I was such a naughty child myself that I know all about it. She is full of spirits, and only needs to be taught what to do with them to be as nice a little girl as Daisy. Those quick wits of hers would enjoy lessons if they were rightly directed, and what is now a tricksy midget would soon become a busy, happy child. I know how to manage her, for I remember how my blessed mother managed me, and if you succeed half as well as she did, you will have done a magnificent work," interrupted Mr. Bear, who labored under the delusion that Mrs. B. was the best and most charming woman alive. "Now, if you make fun of my plan, I'll give you bad copy for a week, and then where are you, sir?" cried Mrs. Joe, tweaking him by the ear just as if he was one of the boys. "Won't Daisy's hair stand erect with horror at Nan's wild ways?" asked Mr. Bear, presently, when Teddy had swarmed up his waistcoat, and Rob up his back, for they always flew at their father the minute school was done. "At first, perhaps, but it will do Posy good. She is getting prim and Betty-ish, and needs stirring up a bit. She always has a good time when Nan comes over to play, and the two will help each other without knowing it. Dear me, half the science of teaching is knowing how much children do for one another, and when to mix them. I only hope she won't turn out another firebrand." "My poor Dan, I never can quite forgive myself for letting him go," sighed Mrs. Bear. At the sound of the name, little Teddy, who had never forgotten his friend, struggled down from his father's arms, and trotted to the door, looked out over the sunny lawn with a wistful face, and then trotted back again, saying, as he always did when disappointed of the longed-for sight, "My Danny's tummin' soon. I really think we ought to have kept him, if only for Teddy's sake, he was so fond of him, and perhaps baby's love would have done for him what we failed to do. I've sometimes felt that myself, but after keeping the boys in a ferment, and nearly burning up the whole family, I thought it safer to remove the firebrand, for a time at least," said Mr. Bear. "Dinner's ready, let me ring the bell," and Rob began a solo upon that instrument which made it impossible to hear oneself speak. "Then I may have Nan, may I?" asked Mrs. Joe. "A dozen Nans if you want them, my dear," answered Mr. Bear, who had room in his fatherly heart for all the naughty, neglected children in the world. When Mrs. Bear returned from her drive that afternoon, before she could unpack the load of little boys, without whom she seldom moved, a small girl of 10 skipped out at the back of the carryall and ran into the house, shouting, "Hi, Daisy, where are you?" Daisy came and looked pleased to see her guest, but also a trifle alarmed, when Nan said, still prancing, as if it was impossible to keep still, "I'm going to stay here always. Papa says I may, and my box is coming tomorrow. All my things had to be washed and mended, and your aunt came and carried me off. Isn't it great fun?" "Why, yes. Did you bring your big doll?" asked Daisy, hoping she had, for on the last visit Nan had ravaged the baby house, and insisted on washing Blanche Matilda's plaster face, which spoiled the poor dear's complexion forever. "Yes, she's somewhere round," returned Nan, with most unmaternal carelessness. "I made you a ring coming along, and pulled the hairs out of Dobbin's tail. Don't you want it?" and Nan presented a horsehair ring in token of friendship, as they had both vowed they would never speak to one another again when they last parted. Won by the beauty of the offering, Daisy grew more cordial, and proposed retiring to the nursery, but Nan said, "No, I want to see the boys and the barn," and ran off, swinging her hat by one string till it broke, when she left it to its fate on the grass. "Hullo, Nan!" cried the boys as she bounced in among them with the announcement, "I'm going to stay." "Hooray!" bawled Tommy from the wall on which he was perched, for Nan was a kindred spirit, and he foresaw larks in the future. "I can bat. Let me play," said Nan, who could turn her hand to anything and did not mind hard knocks. "We ain't playing now, and our side beat without you." "I can beat you in running, anyway," returned Nan, falling back on her strong point. "Can she?" asked Nat of Jack. "She runs very well for a girl," answered Jack, who looked down upon Nan with condescending approval. "Will you try?" said Nan, longing to display her powers. "It's too hot," and Tommy languished against the wall as if quite exhausted. "What's the matter with Stuffy?" asked Nan, whose quick eyes were roving from face to face. "Ball hurt his hand. He howls at everything," answered Jack scornfully. "I don't. I never cry, no matter how I'm hurt. It's babyish," said Nan loftily. "Pooh! I can make you cry in 2 minutes," returned Stuffy, rousing up. "See if you can." "Go and pick that bunch of nettles, then," and Stuffy pointed to a sturdy specimen of that prickly plant growing by the wall. Nan instantly grasped the nettle, pulled it up, and held it with a defiant gesture, in spite of the almost unbearable sting. "Good for you," cried the boys, quick to acknowledge courage even in one of the weaker sex. More nettled than she was, Stuffy determined to get a cry out of her somehow, and he said tauntingly, "You are used to poking your hands into everything, so that isn't fair. Now go and bump your head real hard against the barn, and see if you don't howl then." "Don't do it," said Nat, who hated cruelty. But Nan was off, and running straight at the barn. She gave her head a blow that knocked her flat, and sounded like a battering ram. Dizzy but undaunted, she staggered up, saying stoutly, though her face was drawn with pain, "That hurt, but I don't cry." "Do it again," said Stuffy angrily, and Nan would have done it, but Nat held her, and Tommy, forgetting the heat, flew at Stuffy like a little gamecock, roaring out, "Stop it, or I'll throw you over the barn," and so shook and hustled poor Stuffy that for a minute he did not know whether he was on his head or his heels. "She told me to," was all he could say, when Tommy let him alone. "Never mind if she did. It is awfully mean to hurt a little girl," said Demi reproachfully. "Ho, I don't mind. I ain't a little girl. I'm older than you and Daisy. So now," cried Nan ungratefully. "Don't preach, Deacon. You bully Posy every day of your life," called out the Commodore, who just then hove in sight. "I don't hurt her. Do I, Daisy?" And Demi turned to his sister, who was pouring Nat's tingling hands and recommending water for the purple lump rapidly developing itself on her forehead. "You are the best boy in the world," promptly answered Daisy, adding, as truth compelled her to do, "You hurt me sometimes, but you don't mean to." "Put away the bats and things, and mind what you are about, my hearties. No fighting allowed aboard this ship," said Emil, who rather lorded it over the others. "How do you do, Madge Wildfire?" said Mr. Bear, as Nan came in with the rest to supper. "Give the right hand, little daughter, and mind thy manners," he added, as Nan offered him her left. "The other hurts me." "The poor little hand! What has it been doing to get those blisters?" he asked, drawing it from behind her back, where she had put it with a look which made him think she had been in mischief. Before Nan could think of any excuse, Daisy burst out with the whole story, during which Stuffy tried to hide his face in a bowl of bread and milk. When the table was finished, Mr. Bear looked down the long table towards his wife, and said with a laugh in his eyes, "This rather belongs to your side of the house, so I won't meddle with it, my dear." Mrs. Joe knew what he meant, but she liked her little black sheep all the better for her pluck, though she only said in her soberest way, "Do you know why I asked Nan to come here?" "To plague me," muttered Stuffy, with his mouth full. "To help make little gentlemen of you, and I think you have shown that some of you need it." Here Stuffy retired into his bowl again, and did not emerge till Demi made them all laugh by saying, in his slow, wondering way, "How can she, when she's such a tomboy?" "That's just it. She needs help as much as you, and I expect you set her an example of good manners." "Is she going to be a little gentleman, too?" asked Rob. "She'd like it, wouldn't you, Nan?" added Tommy. "No, I shouldn't. I hate boys," said Nan fiercely, for her hands still smarted, and she began to think that she might have shown her courage in some wiser way. "I am sorry you hate my boys, because they can be well-mannered and most agreeable when they choose. Kindness in looks and words and ways is true politeness, and anyone can have it if they themselves only try to treat other people as they like to be treated themselves. Mrs. Bear had addressed herself to Nan, but the boys nudged one another, and appeared to take the hint, for that time at least, and pass the butter. Said please and thank you, yes sir and no ma'am, with unusual elegance and respect. Nan said nothing, but kept herself quiet and refrained from tickling Demi, though strongly tempted to do so, because of the dignified airs he put on. She also appeared to have forgotten her hatred of boys, and played I Spy with them till dark. Stuffy was observed to offer her frequent sucks on his candy ball during the game, which evidently sweetened her temper, for the last thing she said on going to bed was, "When my battledore and shuttlecock comes, I'll let you all play with them." Her first remark in the morning was, "Has my box come?" And when told that it would arrive sometime during the day, she fretted and fumed and whipped her doll, till Daisy was shocked. She managed to exist, however, till 5 o'clock, when she disappeared, and was not missed till supper time, because those at home thought she had gone to the hill with Tommy and Demi. "I saw her going down the avenue alone as hard as she could pelt," said Mary Ann, coming in with the hasty pudding, and finding everyone asking, "Where is Nan?" "She has run home, little gypsy," cried Mrs. Bear, looking anxious. "Perhaps she has gone to the station to look after her luggage," suggested Franz. "That is impossible. She does not know the way, and if she found it, she could never carry the box a mile," said Mrs. Bear, beginning to think that her new idea might be rather a hard one to carry out. It would be like her, and Mr. Bear caught up his hat to go and find the child, when a shout from Jack, who was at the window, made everyone hurry to the door. There was Miss Nan, to be sure, tugging along a very large bandbox tied up in linen bag. Very hot and dusty and tired did she look, but marched stoutly along, and came puffing up to the steps, where she dropped her load with a sigh of relief, and sat down upon it, observed as she crossed her tired arms, "I couldn't wait any longer, so I went and got it." "But you did not know the way," said Tommy, while the rest stood round enjoying the joke. "Oh, I found it. I never get lost." "It's a mile. How could you go so far?" "Well, it was pretty far, but I rested a good deal." "Wasn't that thing very heavy?" "It's so round I couldn't get hold of it good, and I thought my arms would break right off." "I don't see how the station master let you have it," said Tommy. "I didn't say anything to him. He was in the little ticket place, and didn't see me, so I just took it off the platform." "Run down and tell him it is all right, Franz, or old Dodd will think it is stolen," said Mr. Bear, joining in the shout of laughter at Nan's coolness. "I told you we would send for it if it did not come. Another time you must wait, for you will get into trouble if you run away. Promise me this, or I shall not dare to trust you out of my sight," said Mrs. Bear, wiping the dust off Nan's little hot face. "Well, I won't, only Papa tells me not to put off doing things, so I don't." "That is rather a poser. I think you had better give her some supper now, and a private lecture by and by," said Mr. Bear, too much amused to be angry at the young lady's exploit. The boys thought it great fun, and Nan entertained them all supper time with an account of her adventures. For a big dog had barked at her, a man had laughed at her, a woman had given her a doughnut, and her hat had fallen into the brook when she stopped to drink, exhausted with her exertion. "I fancy you will have your hands full now, my dear. Tommy and Nan are quite enough for one woman," said Mr. Bear, half an hour later. "I know it will take some time to tame the child, but she is such a generous, warm-hearted little thing, I should love her even if she were twice as naughty," answered Mrs. Joe, pointing to the merry group, in the middle of which stood Nan, giving away her things right and left, as lavishly as if the big bandbox had no bottom. It was those good traits that soon made little Giddy-Gaddy, as they called her, a favorite with everyone. Daisy never complained of being dull again, for Nan invented the most delightful plays, and her pranks rivaled Tommy's, to the amusement of the whole school. She buried her big doll and forgot it for a week, and found it well mildewed when she dragged it up. Daisy was in despair, but Nan took it to the painter, who was at work about the house, got him to paint it brick red, with staring black eyes. Then she dressed it up with feathers, and scarlet flannel, and one of Ned's leaden hatchets, and in the character of an Indian chief, the late Poppydilla tomahawked all the other dolls, and caused the nursery to run red with imaginary gore. She gave away her new shoes to a beggar child, hoping to be allowed to go barefoot, but found it impossible to combine charity and comfort, and was ordered to ask leave before disposing of her clothes. She delighted the boys by making a fire-ship out of a shingle with 2 large sails wet with turpentine, which she lighted, and then sent the little vessel floating down the brook at dusk. She harnessed the old turkey-cock to a straw wagon, and made him trot round the house at a tremendous pace. She gave her coral necklace for 4 unhappy kittens, which had been tormented by some heartless lads, and tended them for days as gently as a mother, dressing their wounds with cold cream, feeding them with a doll spoon, and mourning over them when they died, till she was consoled by one of Demi's best turtles. She made Silas tattoo an anchor on her arm like his, and begged hard to have a blue star on each cheek, but he dared not do it, though she coaxed and scolded till the soft-hearted fellow longed to give in. She rode every animal on the place, from the big horse Andy to the cross pig, from whom she was rescued with difficulty. Whatever the boys dared her to do she instantly attempted, no matter how dangerous it might be, and they were never tired of testing her courage. Mr. Bear suggested they should see who would study best, and Nan found as much pleasure in using her quick wits and fine memory as her active feet and merry tongue, while the lads had to do their best to keep their places, for Nan showed them that girls could do most things as well as boys, and some things better. There were no rewards in school, but Mr. Bear's "well done" and Mrs. Bear's good report on the conscience book taught them to love duty for its own sake, and try to do it faithfully. Sure, sooner or later the recompense would come. Little Nan was quick to feel the new atmosphere, to enjoy it, to show that it was what she needed, for this little garden was full of sweet flowers, half hidden by the weeds, and when kind hands gently began to cultivate it, all sorts of green shoots sprung up, promising to blossom beautifully in the warmth of love and care, the best climate for young hearts and souls all the world over. End of Chapter 7. Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 8. Pranks and Plays. As there is no particular plan to this story, except to describe a few scenes in the life at Plumfield for the amusement of certain little persons, we will gently ramble along in this chapter and tell some of the pastimes of Mrs. Joe's boys. I beg leave to assure my honored readers that most of the incidents are taken from real life, and that the oddest are the truest, for no person, no matter how vivid an imagination he may have, can invent anything half so droll as the freaks and fancies that originate in the lively brains of little people. Daisy and Demi were full of these whims, and lived in a world of their own, peopled with lovely or grotesque creatures, to whom they gave the queerest names, and with whom they played the queerest games. One of these nursery inventions was an invisible sprite called the naughty Kitty Mouse, whom the children had believed in, feared, and served for a long time. They seldom spoke of it to anyone else, kept their rights as private as possible, and, as they never tried to describe it even to themselves, this being had a vague, mysterious charm very agreeable to Demi, who delighted in elves and goblins. A most whimsical and tyrannical imp was the naughty Kitty Mouse, and Daisy found a fearful pleasure in its service, blindly obeying its most absurd demands, which were usually proclaimed from the lips of Demi, whose powers of invention were great. Rob and Teddy sometimes joined in these ceremonies, and considered them excellent fun, although they did not understand half that went on. One day after school, Demi whispered to his sister, with an ominous wag of the head, "The Kitty Mouse wants us this afternoon." "What for?" asked Daisy anxiously. "A sacrifice," answered Demi solemnly. "There must be a fire behind the big rock at 2 o'clock, and we must all bring the things we like best, and burn them," he added, with an awful emphasis on the last words. "Oh dear, I love the new paper dollies Aunt Amy painted for me best of anything. Must I burn them up?" cried Daisy, who never thought of denying the unseen tyrant anything it demanded. "Every one. I shall burn my boat, my best scrapbook, and all my soldiers," said Demi firmly. "Well, I will, but it's too bad of Kitty Mouse to want our very nicest things," sighed Daisy. "A sacrifice means to give up what you are fond of, so we must," explained Demi, to whom the new idea had been suggested by hearing Uncle Fritz describe the customs of the Greeks to the big boys who were reading about them in school. "Is Rob coming too?" asked Daisy. "Yes, and he is going to bring his toy village. It is all made of wood, you know, and will burn nicely. We'll have a grand bonfire, and see them blaze up, won't we?" This brilliant prospect consoled Daisy, and she ate her dinner with a row of paper dolls before her, as a sort of farewell banquet. At the appointed hour, the sacrificial train set forth, each child bearing the treasures demanded by the insatiable Kitty Mouse. Teddy insisted on going also, and seeing that all the others had toys, he tucked a squeaking lamb under one arm, and old Annabella under the other, little dreaming what anguish the latter idol was to give him. "Where are you going, my chickens?" asked Mrs. Joe, as the flock passed her door. "To play by the big rock. Can't we?" "Yes, only don't go near the pond, and take good care of baby." "I always do," said Daisy, leading forth her charge with a capable air. "Now, you must all sit round, and not move till I tell you. This flat stone is an altar, and I'm going to make a fire on it." Demi then proceeded to kindle up a small blaze, as he had seen the boys do at picnics. When the flame burned well, he ordered the company to march round it 3 times and then stand in a circle. "I shall begin, and as fast as my things are burnt, you must bring yours." With that he solemnly laid on a little paper book full of pictures, pasted in by himself. This was followed by a dilapidated boat, and then one by one the unhappy leaden soldiers marched to death. Not one faltered or hung back, from the splendid red and yellow captain to the small drummer who had lost his legs. All vanished in the flames and mingled in one common pool of melted lead. "Now, Daisy," called the high priest of Kitty Mouse, when his rich offerings had been consumed, to the great satisfaction of the children. "My dear dollies, how can I let them go?" moaned Daisy, hugging the entire dozen with a face full of maternal woe. "You must," commanded Demi, and with a farewell kiss to each, Daisy laid her blooming dolls upon the coals. "Let me keep one, the dear blue thing, she is so sweet," besought the poor little mamma, clutching her last in despair. "More, more!" growled an awful voice, and Demi cried, "That's the Kitty Mouse. She must have every one, quick, or she will scratch us." In went the precious blue bell, flounces, rosy hat, and all, and nothing but a few black flakes remained of that bright band. "Stand the houses and trees round, and let them catch themselves. It will be like a real fire then," said Demi, who liked variety even in his sacrifices. Charmed by this suggestion, the children arranged the doomed village, laid a line of coals along the main street, and then sat down to watch the conflagration. It was somewhat slow to kindle owing to the paint, but at last one ambitious little cottage blazed up, fired a tree of the palm species, which fell on to the roof of a large family mansion, and in a few minutes the whole town was burning merrily. The wooden population stood and stared at the destruction like blockheads, as they were, till they also caught and blazed away without a cry. It took some time to reduce the town to ashes, and the lookers-on enjoyed the spectacle immensely, cheering as each house fell, dancing like wild Indians when the steeple flamed aloft, and actually casting one wretched little churn-shaped lady, who had escaped to the suburbs, into the very heart of the fire. The superb success of this last offering excited Teddy to such a degree that he first threw his lamb into the conflagration, and before it had time even to roast, he planted poor Annabella on the funeral pyre. Of course she did not like it, and expressed her anguish and resentment in a way that terrified her infant destroyer. Being covered with kid, she did not blaze, but did what was worse, she squirmed. First one leg curled up, then the other, in a very awful and lifelike manner. Next she flung her arms over her head as if in great agony. Her head itself turned on her shoulders, her glass eyes fell out, and with one final writhe of her whole body, she sank down a blackened mass on the ruins of the town. This unexpected demonstration startled everyone and frightened Teddy half out of his little wits. He looked, then screamed and fled toward the house, roaring "Mar-mar" at the top of his voice. Mrs. Bear heard the outcry and ran to the rescue, but Teddy could only cling to her and pour out in his broken way something about poor Bella hurted, a drate fire, and all the dollies dorn. Fearing some dire mishap, his mother caught him up and hurried to the scene of action, where she found the blind worshippers of Kitty Mouse mourning over the charred remains of the lost darling. "What have you been at? Tell me all about it," said Mrs. Joe, composing herself to listen patiently, for the culprits looked so penitent she forgave them beforehand. With some reluctance Demi explained their play, and Aunt Joe laughed till the tears ran down her cheeks, the children were so solemn, and the play was so absurd. "I thought you were too sensible to play such a silly game as this. If I had any Kitty Mouse, I'd have a good one who liked you to play in safe, pleasant ways, and not destroy and frighten. Just see what a ruin you have made. All Daisy's pretty dolls, Demi's soldiers, and Rob's new village, beside poor Teddy's pet lamb, and dear old Annabella. I shall have to write up in the nursery the verse that used to come in the boxes of toys. The children of Holland take pleasure in making what the children of Boston take pleasure in breaking. Only I shall put Plumfield instead of Boston." "We'll never again, truly, truly," cried the repentant little sinners, much abashed at this reproof. "Demi told us to," said Rob. "Well, I heard Uncle tell about the Grease people, who had altars and things, and so I wanted to be like them, only I hadn't any live creatures to sacrifice, so we burnt up our toys." "Dear me, that is something like the bean story," said Aunt Joe, laughing again. "Tell about it," suggested Daisy, to change the subject. "Once there was a poor woman who had 3 or 4 little children, and she used to lock them up in her room when she went out to work, to keep them safe. One day, when she was going away, she said, Now, my dears, don't let baby fall out of the window, don't play with the matches, and don't put beans up your noses." Now the children had never dreamed of doing that last thing, but she put it into their heads, and the minute she was gone, they ran and stuffed their naughty little noses full of beans, just to see how it felt, and she found them all crying when she came home. "Did it hurt?" asked Rob, with such intense interest that his mother hastily added a warning sequel, lest a new edition of the bean story should appear in her own family. "Very much, as I know, for when my mother told me the story, I was so silly that I went and tried it myself. I had no beans, so I took some little pebbles, and poked several into my nose. I did not like it at all, and wanted to take them out again very soon, but one would not come, and I was so ashamed to tell what a goose I had been, that I went for hours with the stone hurting me very much. At last the pain got so bad I had to tell, and when my mother could not get it out, the doctor came. Then I was put in a chair and held tight, Rob, while he used his ugly little pincers till the stone hopped out. Dear me, how my wretched little nose did ache, and how people laughed at me!" And Mrs. Joe shook her head in a dismal way, as if the memory of her sufferings was too much for her. Rob looked deeply impressed, and I am glad to say took the warning to heart. Demi proposed that they should bury poor Annabella, and in the interest of the funeral Teddy forgot his fright. Daisy was soon consoled by another batch of dolls from Aunt Amy, and the naughty Kitty Mouse seemed to be appeased by the last offerings, for she tormented them no more. Brops was the name of a new and absorbing play invented by Bangs. As this interesting animal is not to be found in any zoological garden, unless Du Chaillu has recently brought one from the wilds of Africa, I will mention a few of its peculiar habits and traits, for the benefit of inquiring minds. The Brop is a winged quadruped, with a human face of a youthful and merry aspect. When it walks the earth it grunts, when it soars it gives a shrill hoot, occasionally it goes erect, and talks good English. Its body is usually covered with a substance much resembling a shawl, sometimes red, sometimes blue, often plaid, and, strange to say, they frequently change skins with one another. On their heads they have a horn very like a stiff brown paper lamplighter. Wings of the same substance flap upon their shoulders when they fly. This is never very far from the ground, as they usually fall with violence if they attempt any lofty flights. They browse over the earth, but can sit up and eat like the squirrel. Their favorite nourishment is the seed cake. Apples also are freely taken, and sometimes raw carrots are nibbled when food is scarce. They live in dens, where they have a sort of nest, much like a clothes basket, in which the little Brops play till their wings are grown. These singular animals quarrel at times, and it is on these occasions that they burst into human speech, call each other names, cry, scold, and sometimes tear off horns and skin, declaring fiercely that they won't play. The few privileged persons who have studied them are inclined to think them a remarkable mixture of the monkey, the sphinx, the roc, and the queer creatures seen by the famous Peter Wilkins. This game was a great favorite, and the younger children beguiled many a rainy afternoon flapping or creeping about the nursery, acting like little bedlamites and being as merry as little grigs. To be sure, it was rather hard upon clothes, particularly trouser knees and jacket elbows, but Mrs. Bear only said, as she patched and darned, "We do things just as foolish, and not half so harmless. If I could get as much happiness out of it as the little dears do, I'd be a Brop myself." Nat's favorite amusements were working in his garden and sitting in the willow tree with his violin, for that great nest was a fairy world to him, and there he loved to perch, making music like a happy bird. The lads called him Old Chirper, because he was always humming, whistling, or fiddling, and they often stopped a minute in their work or play to listen to the soft tones of the violin, which seemed to lead a little orchestra of summer sounds. The birds appeared to regard him as one of themselves, and fearlessly sat on the fence or lit among the boughs to watch him with their quick, bright eyes. The robins in the apple tree near by evidently considered him a friend, for the father bird hunted insects close beside him, and the little mother brooded as confidingly over her blue eggs as if the boy was only a new sort of blackbird who cheered her patient watch with his song. The brown brook babbled and sparkled below him, the bees haunted the clover fields on either side, friendly faces peeped at him as they passed, the old house stretched its wide wings hospitably toward him, and with a blessed sense of rest and love and happiness, Nat dreamed for hours in this nook, unconscious what healthful miracles were being wrought upon him. One listener he had who never tired, and to whom he was more than a mere schoolmate. Poor Billy's chief delight was to lie beside the brook, watching leaves and bits of foam dance by, listening dreamily to the music in the willow tree. He seemed to think Nat a sort of angel who sat aloft and sang, for a few baby memories still lingered in his mind, and seemed to grow brighter at these times. Seeing the interest he took in Nat, Mr. Bear begged him to help them lift the cloud from the feeble brain by this gentle spell. glad to do anything to show his gratitude. Nat always smiled on Billy when he followed him about, and let him listen undisturbed to the music which seemed to speak a language he could understand. Help one another was a favorite Plumfield motto, and Nat learned how much sweetness is added to life by trying to live up to it. Jack Ford's peculiar pastime was buying and selling, and he bid fair to follow in the footsteps of his uncle, a country merchant, who sold a little of everything and made money fast. Jack had seen the sugar sanded, the molasses watered, the butter mixed with lard, and things of that kind, and labored under the delusion that it was all a proper part of the business. His stock in trade was of a different sort, but he got as much as he could out of every worm he sold, and always got the best of the bargain when he traded with the boys for string, knives, fishhooks, whatever the article might be. The boys, who all had nicknames, called him Skinflint, but Jack did not care, as long as the old tobacco pouch in which he kept his money grew heavier and heavier. He established a sort of auction room, and now and then sold off all the odds and ends he had collected, or helped the lads exchange things with one another. He got bats, balls, hockey sticks, etc., cheap, from one set of mates, furbished them up, and let them for a few cents a time to another set, often extending his business beyond the gates of Plumfield in spite of the rules. Mr. Bear put a stop to some of his speculations, and tried to give him a better idea of business talent than mere sharpness in overreaching his neighbors. Now and then Jack made a bad bargain, and felt worse about it than about any failure in lessons or conduct, and took his revenge on the next innocent customer who came along. His account book was a curiosity, and his quickness at figures quite remarkable. Mr. Bear praised him for this, and tried to make his sense of honesty and honor as quick. And by, when Jack found that he could not get on without these virtues, he owned that his teacher was right. Cricket and football the boys had, of course, but, after the stirring accounts of these games in the immortal Tom Brown at Rugby, no feeble female pen may venture to do more than respectfully allude to them. Emil spent his holidays on the river or the pond, and drilled the elder lads for a race with certain town boys, who now and then invaded their territory. The race duly came off, but as it ended in a general shipwreck, it was not mentioned in public, and the Commodore had serious thoughts of retiring to a desert island, so disgusted was he with his kind for a time. No desert island being convenient, he was forced to remain among his friends, and found consolation in building a boathouse. The little girls indulged in the usual plays of their age, improving upon them somewhat as their lively fancies suggested. The chief and most absorbing play was called Mrs. Shakespeare Smith. The name was provided by Aunt Jo, but the trials of the poor lady were quite original. Daisy was Mrs. S.S., and Nan by turns her daughter, or a neighbor, Mrs. Giddy-Gaddy. No pen can describe the adventures of these ladies, for in one short afternoon their family was the scene of birth, marriages, deaths, floods, earthquakes, tea parties, and balloon ascensions. Millions of miles did these energetic women travel, dressed in hats and habits never seen before by mortal eye, perched on the bed, driving the post like mettlesome steeds, and bouncing up and down till their heads spun. Fits and fires were the pet afflictions, with a general massacre now and then by way of change. Nan was never tired of inventing fresh combinations, and Daisy followed her leader with blind admiration. Poor Teddy was a frequent victim, and was often rescued from real danger, for the excited ladies were apt to forget that he was not of the same stuff as their long-suffering dolls. Once he was shut into the closet for a dungeon, and forgotten by the girls, who ran off to some out-of-door game. Another time he was half drowned in the bathtub, playing to be a cunning little whale, and, worst of all, he was cut down just in time after being hung up for a robber. But the institution most patronized by all was the club. It had no other name, and it needed none, being the only one in the neighborhood. The elder lads got it up, and the younger were occasionally admitted if they behaved well. Tommy and Demi were honorary members, but were always obliged to retire unpleasantly early, owing to circumstances over which they had no control. The proceedings of this club were somewhat peculiar, for it met at all sorts of places and hours, had all manner of queer ceremonies and amusements, and now and then was broken up tempestuously, only to be re-established, however, on a firmer basis. Rainy evenings the members met in the schoolroom, and passed the time in games, chess, morris, backgammon, fencing matches, recitations, debates, or dramatic performances of a darkly tragical nature. In summer the barn was the rendezvous, and what went on there no uninitiated mortal knows. On sultry evenings the club adjourned to the brook for aquatic exercises, and the members sat about in airy attire, frog-like and cool. On such occasions the speeches were unusually eloquent, quite flowing, as one might say, and if any orator's remarks displeased the audience, cold water was thrown upon him till his ardor was effectually quenched. Franz was president, and maintained order admirably, considering the unruly nature of the members. Mr. Bear never interfered with their affairs, and was rewarded for this wise forbearance by being invited now and then to behold the mysteries unveiled, which he appeared to enjoy much. When Nan came, she wished to join the club, and caused great excitement and division among the gentlemen by presenting endless petitions, both written and spoken, disturbing their solemnities by insulting them through the keyhole, performing vigorous solos on the door, and writing up derisive remarks on walls and fences, for she belonged to the irrepressibles. Finding these appealed in vain, the girls, by the advice of Mrs. Joe, got up an institution of their own, which they called the Cozy Club. To this they magnanimously invited the gentlemen whose youth excluded them from the other one, and entertained these favored beings so well with their little suppers, new games devised by Nan, and other pleasing festivities, that, one by one, the elder boys confessed a desire to partake of these more elegant enjoyments, and, after much consultation, finally decided to propose an interchange of civilities. The members of the Cozy Club were invited to adorn the rival establishment on certain evenings, and to the surprise of the gentlemen their presence was not found to be a restraint upon the conversation or amusement of the regular frequenters, which could not be said of all clubs, I fancy. The ladies responded handsomely and hospitably to these overtures of peace, and both institutions flourished long and happily. End of Chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Little Men by Louisa May Alcott. Chapter 9. Daisy's Ball. Mrs. Shakespeare Smith would like to have Mr. John Brooke, Mr. Thomas Bangs, and Mr. Nathaniel Blake to come to her ball at 3 o'clock today. P.S. Nat must bring his fiddle so we can dance, and all the boys must be good, or they cannot have any of the nice things we have cooked. This elegant invitation would, I fear, have been declined, but for the hint given in the last line of the postscript. They have been cooking lots of goodies. I smelt 'em. Let's go, said Tommy. We didn't stay after the feast, you know, added Demi. I never went to a ball. What do you have to do? Asked Nat. Oh, we just play men, and sit round stiff and stupid like grown-up folks, and dance to please the girls. Then we can eat up everything, and come away as soon as we can. I think I could do that, said Nat, after considering Tommy's description for a minute. I'll write and say we'll come, and Demi dispatched the following gentlemanly reply. We will all come. Please have lots to eat. J.B. Esquire. Great was the anxiety of the ladies about their first ball, because if everything went well they intended to give a dinner party to the chosen few. Aunt Jo likes to have the boys play with us, if they are not rough, so we must make them like our balls, then they will do them good, said Daisy, with her maternal air, as she set the table and surveyed the store of refreshments with an anxious eye. Demi and Nat will be good, but Tommy will do something bad, I know he will, replied Nan, shaking her head over the little cake basket which she was arranging. Then I shall send him right home, said Daisy, with decision. People don't do so at parties. It isn't proper. I shall never ask him any more. That would do. He'd be sorry not to come to the dinner ball, wouldn't he? I guess he would. We'll have the splendidest things ever seen, won't we? Real soup with a ladle and a tureen. She meant tureen. And a little bird for turkey, and gravy, and all kinds of nice vegetables. Daisy never could say vegetables properly, and had given up trying. It is most 3, and we ought to dress, said Nan, who had arranged a fine costume for the occasion, and was anxious to wear it. I am the mother, so I shan't dress up much, said Daisy, putting on a nightcap ornamented with a red bow, one of her aunt's long skirts, and a shawl. A pair of spectacles and a large pocket handkerchief completed her toilette, making a plump, rosy little matron of her. Nan had a wreath of artificial flowers, a pair of old pink slippers, a yellow scarf, a green muslin skirt, and a fan made of feathers from the duster. Also, as a last touch of elegance, a smelling bottle without any smell in it. I am the daughter, so I rig up a good deal, and I must sing and dance, and talk more than you do. The mothers only get the tea and be proper, you know. A sudden, very loud knock caused Miss Smith to fly into a chair, and fan herself violently, while her mamma sat bolt upright on the sofa, and tried to look quite calm and proper. Little Bess, who was on a visit, acted the part of maid, and opened the door, saying with a smile, "Ward in, gentlemen. It's all ready." In honor of the occasion, the boys wore high paper collars, tall black hats, and gloves of every color and material, for they were an afterthought, and not a boy among them had a perfect pair. "Good day, Mum," said Demi, in a deep voice, which was so hard to keep up that his remarks had to be extremely brief. Every one shook hands and then sat down, looking so funny, yet so sober, that the gentlemen forgot their manners and rolled in their chairs with laughter. "Oh, don't!" cried Mrs. Smith, much distressed. "You can't ever come again if you act so," added Miss Smith, rapping Mr. Bangs with her bottle because he laughed loudest. "I can't help it. You look so furry," gasped Mr. Bangs, with most uncourteous candor. "So do you, but I shouldn't be so rude as to say so. He shan't come to the dinner ball, shall he, Daisy?" cried Nan, indignantly. "I think we had better dance now. Did you bring your fiddle, sir?" asked Mrs. Smith, trying to preserve her polite composure. "It is outside the door, and Nat went to get it." "Better have tea first," proposed the unabashed Tommy, winking openly at Demi to remind him that the sooner the refreshments were secured, the sooner they could escape. "No, we never have supper first. And if you don't dance, well, you won't have any supper at all, not one bit, sir," said Mrs. Smith, so sternly that her wild guest saw she was not to be trifled with, and grew overwhelmingly civil all at once. "I will take Mr. Bangs and teach him the polka, for he does not know it fit to be seen," added the hostess, with a reproachful look that sobered Tommy at once. Nat struck up, and the ball opened with two couples, who went conscientiously through a somewhat varied dance. The ladies did well, because they liked it, but the gentlemen exerted themselves from more selfish motives, for each felt that he must earn his supper, and labored manfully toward that end. When every one was out of breath, they were allowed to rest, and, indeed, poor Mrs. Smith needed it, for her long dress had tripped her up many times. The little maid passed round molasses and water in such small cups that one guest actually emptied 9. I refrain from mentioning his name, because this mild beverage affected him so much that he put cup and all into his mouth at the 9th round, and choked himself publicly. "You must ask Nan to play and sing now," said Daisy to her brother, who sat looking very much like an owl, as he gravely regarded the festive scene between his high collars. "Give us a song, Mum," said the obedient guest, secretly wondering where the piano was. Miss Smith sailed up to an old secretary which stood in the room, threw back the lid of the writing desk, and sitting down before it, accompanied herself with a vigor which made the old desk rattle as she sang that new and lovely song, beginning, "Gaily the troubadour touched his guitar, as he was hastening home from the war." The gentlemen applauded so enthusiastically that she gave them Bounding Billows, Little Bo Peep, and other gems of song, till they were obliged to hint that they had had enough. Grateful for the praises bestowed upon her daughter, Mrs. Smith graciously announced, "Now we will have tea. Sit down carefully, and don't grab." It was beautiful to see the air of pride with which the good lady did the honors of her table, and the calmness with which she bore the little mishaps that occurred. The best pie flew wildly on the floor when she tried to cut it with a very dull knife. The bread and butter vanished with a rapidity calculated to dismay a housekeeper's soul, and, worst of all, the custards were so soft they had to be drunk up instead of being eaten elegantly with the new tin spoons. I grieve to state that Miss Smith squabbled with the maid for the best jumble, which caused Bess to toss the whole dish into the air, and burst out crying amid a rain of falling cakes. She was comforted by a seat at the table, and their sugar bowl to empty, but during this flurry a large plate of patties was mysteriously lost, and could not be found. They were the chief ornament of the feast, and Mrs. Smith was indignant at the loss, for she had made them herself, and they were beautiful to behold. I put it to any lady if it was not hard to have 12 delicious patties, made of flour, salt, and water, with a large raisin in the middle of each, and much sugar over the whole, swept away at one fell swoop. "You hid them, Tommy. I know you did," cried the outraged hostess, threatening her suspected guest with the milk-pot. "I didn't." "You did." "It isn't proper to contradict," said Nan, who was hastily eating up the jelly during the fray. "Give them back, Demi," said Tommy. "That's a fib. You've got them in your own pocket," bawled Demi, roused by the false accusation. "Let's take 'em away from him. It's too bad to make Daisy cry," suggested Nat, who found his first ball more exciting than he expected. Daisy was already weeping. Bess, like a devoted servant, mingled her tears with those of her mistress, and Nan denounced the entire race of boys as plaguey things. Meanwhile the battle raged among the gentlemen, for, when the two defenders of innocence fell upon the foe, that hardened youth entrenched himself behind a table, and pelted them with the stolen tarts, which were very effective missiles, being nearly as hard as bullets. While his ammunition held out, the besieged prospered, but the moment the last patty flew over the parapet, the villain was seized, dragged howling from the room, and cast upon the hall floor in an ignominious heap. The conquerors then returned, flushed with victory, and while Demi consoled poor Mrs. Smith, Nat and Nan collected the scattered tarts, replaced each raisin in its proper bed, and rearranged the dish so that it really looked almost as well as ever. But their glory had departed, for the sugar was gone, and no one cared to eat them after the insult offered to them. "I guess we had better go," said Demi suddenly, as Aunt Joe's voice was heard on the stairs. Perhaps we had, and Nat hastily dropped a stray jumble that he had just picked up. But Mrs. Joe was among them before the retreat was accomplished, and into her sympathetic ear the young ladies poured the story of their woes. "No more balls for these boys till they have atoned for this bad behavior by doing something kind to you," said Mrs. Joe, shaking her head at the three culprits. "We were only in fun," began Demi. "I don't like fun that makes other people unhappy. I am disappointed in you, Demi, for I hoped you would never learn to tease Daisy, such a kind little sister as she is to you." "Boys always tease their sisters. Tom says so," muttered Demi. "I don't intend that my boy shall, and I must send Daisy home if you cannot play happily together," said Aunt Jo soberly. At this awful threat, Demi sidled up to his sister, and Daisy hastily dried her tears, for to be separated was the worst misfortune that could happen to the twins. "Nat was bad, too, and Tommy was baddest of all," observed Nan, fearing that two of the sinners would not get their fair share of punishment. "I am sorry," said Nat, much ashamed. "I ain't," bawled Tommy through the keyhole, where he was listening with all his might. Mrs. Joe wanted very much to laugh, but kept her countenance, and said impressively, as she pointed to the door, "You can go, boys, but remember, you are not to speak to or play with the little girls till I give you leave. You don't deserve the pleasure, so I forbid it." The ill-mannered young gentleman hastily retired, to be received outside with derision and scorn by the unrepentant Bangs, who would not associate with them for at least 15 minutes. Daisy was soon consoled for the failure of her ball, but lamented the edict that parted her from her brother, and mourned over his shortcomings in her tender little heart. Nan rather enjoyed the trouble, and went about turning up her pug nose at the three, especially Tommy, who pretended not to care, and loudly proclaimed his satisfaction at being rid of those stupid girls. But in his secret soul he soon repented of the rash act that caused this banishment from the society he loved, and every hour of separation taught him the value of the stupid girls. The others gave in very soon, and longed to be friends, for now there was no Daisy to pet and cook for them, no Nan to amuse and doctor them, and, worst of all, no Mrs. Joe to make home life pleasant and life easy for them. To their great affliction, Mrs. Joe seemed to consider herself one of the offended girls, for she hardly spoke to the outcasts, looked as if she did not see them when she passed, and was always too busy now to attend to their requests. This sudden and entire exile from favor cast a gloom over their souls, for when Mother Bear deserted them, their sun had set at noonday, as it were, and they had no refuge left. This unnatural state of things actually lasted for 3 days. Then they could bear it no longer, and fearing that the eclipse might become total, went to Mr. Bear for help and counsel. It is my private opinion that he had received instructions how to behave if the case should be laid before him. But no one suspected it, and he gave the afflicted boys some advice, which they gratefully accepted and carried out in the following manner. Secluding themselves in the garret, they devoted several play hours to the manufacture of some mysterious machine, which took so much paste that Asia grumbled, and the little girls wondered mightily. Nan nearly got her inquisitive nose pinched in the door, trying to see what was going on, and Daisy sat about, openly lamenting that they could not all play nicely together, and not have any dreadful secrets. Wednesday afternoon was fine, and after a good deal of consultation about wind and weather, Nat and Tommy went off, bearing an immense flat parcel hidden under many newspapers. Nan nearly died with suppressed curiosity, Daisy nearly cried with vexation, and both quite trembled with interest when Demi marched into Mrs. Bear's room, hat in hand, and said, in the politest tone possible to a mortal boy of his years, "Please, Aunt Jo, would you and the girls come out to a surprise party we have made for you? Do, it's a very nice one." "Thank you, we will come with pleasure. Only I must take Teddy with me," replied Mrs. Bear, with a smile that cheered Demi like sunshine after rain. "We'd like to have him. The little wagon is all ready for the girls. You won't mind walking just up to Pennyroyal Hill, will you, Auntie?" "I should like it exceedingly. But you are quite sure I shall not be in the way?" "Oh, no, indeed. We want you very much." "And the party would be spoilt if you don't come," cried Demi, with great earnestness. "Thank you kindly, sir," and Aunt Jo made him a grand curtsy, for she liked frolics as well as any of them. "Now, young ladies, we must not keep them waiting. On with the hats, and let us be off at once. I am all impatience to know what the surprise is." As Mrs. Bear spoke, everyone bustled about, and in 5 minutes the 3 little girls and Teddy were packed into the clothes basket, as they called the wicker wagon which Toby drew. Demi walked at the head of the procession, and Mrs. Joe brought up the rear, escorted by Kit. It was a most imposing party, I assure you, for Toby had a red feather duster in his head, 2 remarkable flags waved over the carriage, Kit had a blue bow on his neck, which nearly drove him wild, Demi wore a nosegay of dandelions in his buttonhole, and Mrs. Joe carried the queer Japanese umbrella in honor of the occasion. The girls had little flutters of excitement all the way, and Teddy was so charmed with the drive that he kept dropping his hat overboard, and when it was taken from him he prepared to tumble out himself, evidently feeling that it behooved him to do something for the amusement of the party. When they came to the hill, nothing was to be seen but the grass blowing in the wind, as the fairy books say, and the children looked disappointed, but Demi said in his most impressive manner, "Now, you all get out and stand still, and the surprise party will come in," with which remark he retired behind a rock, over which heads had been bobbing at intervals for the last half-hour. A short pause of intense suspense, and then Nat, Demi, and Tommy marched forth, each bearing a new kite, which they presented to the three young ladies. Shrieks of delight arose, but were silenced by the boys, who said, with faces brimful of merriment, "That isn't all the surprise," and, running behind the rock, again emerged bearing a fourth kite of superb size, on which was printed, in bright yellow letters, "For Mother Bear." "We thought you'd like one, too, because you were angry with us, and took the girls' part," cried all three, shaking with laughter, for this part of the affair evidently was a surprise to Mrs. Joe. She clapped her hands, and joined in the laugh, looking thoroughly tickled at the joke. "Now, boys, that is regularly splendid. Who did think of it?" she asked, receiving the monster kite with as much pleasure as the little girls did theirs. "Uncle Fritz proposed it when we planned to make the others. He said you'd like it, so we made a bouncer," answered Demi, beaming with satisfaction at the success of the plot. "Uncle Fritz knows what I like. Yes, these are magnificent kites, and we were wishing we had some the other day when you were flying yours, weren't we, girls?" "That's why we made them for you," cried Tommy, standing on his head as the most appropriate way of expressing his emotions. "Let us fly them," said energetic Nan. "I don't know how," began Daisy. "We'll show you, we want to," cried all the boys in a burst of devotion, as Demi took Daisy's, Tommy Nan's, and Nat, with difficulty, persuaded Bess to let go her little blue one. "Auntie, if you will wait a minute, we'll pitch yours for you," said Demi, feeling that Mrs. Bear's favor must not be lost again by any neglect of theirs. "Bless your buttons, dear, I know all about it, and here is a boy who will toss up for me," added Mrs. Joe, as the professor peeped over the rock with a face full of fun. He came out at once, tossed up the big kite, and Mrs. Joe ran off with it in fine style, while the children stood and enjoyed the spectacle. One by one all the kites went up, and floated far overhead like gay birds, balancing themselves on the fresh breeze that blew steadily over the hill. Such a merry time as they had, running and shouting, sending up the kites or pulling them down, watching their antics in the air, and feeling them tug at the string like live creatures trying to escape. Nan was quite wild with the fun. Daisy thought the new play nearly as interesting as dolls, and little Bess was so fond of her Boo Tight that she would only let it go on very short flights, preferring to hold it in her lap and look at the remarkable pictures painted on it by Tommy's dashing brush. Mrs. Joe enjoyed hers immensely, and it acted as if it knew who owned it, for it came tumbling down head first when least expected, caught on trees, nearly pitched into the river, and finally darted away to such a height that it looked a mere speck among the clouds. By and by everyone got tired, and fastening the kite strings to trees and fences, all sat down to rest, except Mr. Bear, who went off to look at the cows, with Teddy on his shoulder. "Did you ever have such a good time as this before?" asked Nat, as they lay about on the grass, nibbling pennyroyal like a flock of sheep. "Not since I last flew a kite, years ago, when I was a girl," answered Mrs. Joe. "I'd like to have known you when you were a girl. You must have been so jolly," said Nat. "I was a naughty little girl, I am sorry to say." "I like naughty little girls," observed Tommy, looking at Nan, who made a frightful grimace at him in return for the compliment. "Why don't I remember you then, Auntie? Was I too young?" asked Demi. "Rather, dear." "I suppose my memory hadn't come then. Grandpa says that different parts of the mind unfold as we grow up, and the memory part of my mind hadn't unfolded when you were little, so I can't remember how you looked," explained Demi. "Now, little Socrates, you had better keep that question for Grandpa. It is beyond me," said Aunt Joe, putting on the extinguisher. "Well, I will. He knows about those things, and you don't," returned Demi, feeling that on the whole kites were better adapted to the comprehension of the present company. "Tell about the last time you flew a kite," said Nat, for Mrs. Joe had laughed as she spoke of it, and he thought it might be interesting. "Oh, it was only rather funny, for I was a great girl of 15, and was ashamed to be seen at such a play. So Uncle Teddy and I privately made our kites, and stole away to fly them. We had a capital time, and were resting as we are now, when suddenly we heard voices, and saw a party of young ladies and gentlemen coming back from a picnic. Teddy did not mind, though he was rather a large boy to be playing with the kite, but I was in a great flurry, for I knew I should be sadly laughed at, and never hear the last of it, because my wild ways amused the neighbors as much as Nan's do us. "What shall I do?" I whispered to Teddy, as the voices drew nearer and nearer. "I'll show you," he said, and whipping out his knife he cut the strings. Away flew the kites, and when the people came up we were picking flowers as properly as you please. They never suspected us, and we had a grand laugh over our narrow escape. "Were the kites lost, Auntie?" asked Daisy. "Quite lost, but I did not care, for I made up my mind that it would be best to wait till I was an old lady before I played with kites again, and you see I have waited," said Mrs. Joe, beginning to pull in the big kite, for it was getting late. "Must we go now?" "I must, or you won't have any supper, and that sort of surprise party would not suit you, I think, my chickens." "Hasn't our party been a nice one?" asked Tommy complacently. "Splendid," answered everyone. "Do you know why? It is because your guests have behaved themselves, and tried to make everything go well. You understand what I mean, don't you?" "Yes'm," was all the boys said, for they stole a shamefaced look at one another, as they meekly shouldered their kites and walked home, thinking of another party where the guests had not behaved themselves, and things had gone badly on account of it. End of chapter 9.